Hey everyone, it's Dara. So today we're going to talk about lesson planning. Now for some ESL teachers this could be a very dreadful experience, or for some of us it could be a way to really show our creative side. So let's get started. Now in my blog, motivationesl.blogspot.com, I will talk more in detail about how to create a lesson plan. But for this video, I'm just going to talk briefly about how to create a lesson as well as how to implement it to your students. Now again, depending on the ESL program that you belong to or the school that you're teaching at, this will indeed vary. But for the most part, the general idea of lesson planning is, number one, you want to have an objective. What is it that you're going to teach your students for that particular day? Now some programs, they will require you to have a lesson plan every day, or they just want you to have a lesson plan that will cover the topics of what you're going to be teaching for the week. So again, this will vary. My personal suggestion is I would lesson plan every day. Now you might think that could be a bit much, but in a way it's not, because depending on the level that you're teaching, depending on the textbook or the materials that you're using, daily lessons can be very effective, because every day you're going to be talking about something different, or you're going to be expanding on a specific topic that you are presenting to your class. Now this can be a challenge because, again, as we all know as teachers, you may have this really nice lesson plan, you're ready to implement it to your students, and things take a different turn. Sometimes students will not be able to follow you step by step within your lesson because, let's face it, everybody learns at different stages, at different levels. So for example, you might have, say, an intermediate class. Let's say it's level 3. And in your mind, you're thinking, okay, I have this great topic I want to teach, and I know the grammar points I'm going to cover, I know the vocabulary I'm going to introduce, etc., etc. But somewhere along the way, maybe you have a handful of students, or majority of this class, that might have questions, say, on the grammar point. No matter how you explain it to the students, they're just not grasping the material as you thought. So now you might be spending a little more time on those grammar points, and you may not get to the vocabulary part until maybe day 3, day 4, or even day 5. And depending also on the level of students that you have and what you're teaching, this can extend to the following week. So what are some things you can do to kind of avoid that from happening, or at least coping with it? Number one, you want to keep it simple. You don't want to get too overly technical and get too overly detailed as when it comes to activities. You want to kind of keep it basic and simple. I've learned from my experience that when you keep things simple, it makes things more effective. So don't stress out too much about every single detail. If you're going to teach, for example, present perfect tense, and that's the grammar point, then you know that's what you're going to focus on. If you are talking about job search in this class, and maybe in your textbook you're up to the unit where they're talking about how to find a job, focus on that. Maybe if you want to talk about resume or how to write a resume, but if your students are struggling in the first part of the lesson, maybe you might want to save the resume part another day or a day after. You are the teacher, as always, so you have control of this car. As I said in my last video, you are the driver of your own car. But you want to keep in mind that you don't want to go too fast and you don't want to go too slow. I understand that in a lot of ESL programs that there is a time limit, and a lot of times in many programs there's a certain amount of time that we can give students to really teach whatever topics we have to cover. So I'm not suggesting that you take 3 weeks on one subject, but you want to go at a pace that's comfortable for your students as well as for yourself. And you want to make sure you can cover all those elements in a way where most of your students won't fall behind, but in fact they can keep up with you. Another way to help you through this process is by pairing. When you pair students together, this also helps in this process. Although you are the driver of your own car, but you have many passengers in this car, and you can't always control what's going on behind you, because if you're looking forward and you're making sure that you're driving on the road, on the right side of the road, you can't be turning back to see what's going on with your passengers. Same principle in a classroom. So what you want to do is you want to pair students together. A lot of times what I used to do is if I had a student who might be right there, let's say this student is with me no matter what I'm teaching, he or she just grasps it and they're right at the same pace as I am. But you have another student that's kind of weak in a certain area. Maybe the grammar is just a little difficult for him. So I might pair him with this student. They will work together. And make sure that students don't always rely solely on the teacher to learn the language, but also on their peers. And peer learning is very effective because some students do feel more comfortable working with their peers as opposed to raising their hand or asking the teacher questions. Now, when it comes to implementing your lessons, one of the things that you want to be a little careful with is you want to ease the students in gradually. So you don't want to just jump in and just start talking and you start throwing up all these diagrams and pictures and talking all fast, because remember, you speak the language, they don't. You understand the concepts, they don't. So you want to take your time. If you're teaching a lower level class, let me just say this right now, you will be repeating a lot. So if you're not a person who likes to repeat, maybe a lower level class may not work for you because it's a lot of repetition. But the same goes for advanced classes too. You may not have to repeat the same thing 5-6 times, but you will find yourself doing reviews with your students. So again, repetition and reviewing is going to be part of this process, whether you like it or not. You start to implement your lesson. A lot of times what I like to do is I like to start off with a question. So for example, if we go back to the job search lesson, I might say to the class, how many of you have a job? Raise your hand. Now depending on the response, then I know how to follow up with this question. If maybe few people raise their hand, I might say, how many of you are looking for a job? And then they raise their hand. And then based on that, that's when I'll lead into my lesson. We have a lot of great textbooks and materials out there that actually outlines the lesson for you. So you might be having a specific topic you're discussing with your students, and the textbook is so designed, the textbook is designed in such a way that you may not have to do heavy lesson planning because it's kind of outlined for you. It's always good to have your own plan. It's always good to have your own outline of what you want to cover, because you don't want to solely rely on a textbook, because again, it's your creativity, it's your class, and it's your students. And I can say from experience, I have tried using the textbook, pre-lesson plan, which has worked, and then I tried it in some of my classes and it did not. So you have to be your own judge. Let's talk about time. Time is very crucial because, again, depending on the ESL program you're part of, and for most programs, there's a time crunch. Make sure that your students are getting the most out of the lesson in a short amount of time. And you want to make sure that you cover whatever that's in that lesson for the day, or at least whatever the syllabus that's presented to you from your program, say director or coordinator, or however the setup is for you. Now, time can be your best friend or it can be your worst enemy. I cannot tell you how many times I have messed up when it comes to time, because I have this great lesson. It's set up in a way that's comfortable for me. My students are with me, we're going, we're flowing, everything's great, and then sometimes we'll start up a conversation on one point and we're talking and going, and next thing you know, we might have spent 20 minutes on something that might have lasted only 5 minutes. And so now that we get to maybe the heart of the lesson that should take a long time, now we have to extend it to the next day because we ran out of time. One way to help you with this is on your lesson plan, you can actually put a little time as to a little estimate of time that you want to spend on, say for example, what some of us like to call the preview. So maybe you start off by giving a little preview of what you're going to talk about by asking questions, maybe taking a survey. I used to draw a bubble map, and what I would do was called brainstorming activities, which I will talk more about that in this series, where you want to get the students talking and throw ideas to you as opposed to you just throwing all the ideas to them. Remember, this is an English class and you want to encourage your students to talk, so you don't want to be the lecturer and do all the talking. I'm guilty of this, believe me, so I'm telling you from experience. 5-minute preview, and then maybe the introduction to the lesson. You might spend 10 to 15 minutes. There might be an activity that might be last for maybe 5 to 7 minutes. You go over it, you do a little review, you move on to the next thing. If you go over time, make sure that the next day you do a review. Reviewing is important no matter what, but if you go over time and let's say you missed a point in your last lesson, do a review the next day, incorporate where you left off, and then move on to the next part of your lesson. That way it's more of a continuous thing. It feels more like a flow as opposed to just coming in and just starting where you left off and then skipping to something brand new and there's no review. Students need to always need to review what they've learned, because when they review, it reinforces what they've learned. It helps them to remember. Homework assignments, in-classroom assignments, these are also great ways to review with your students. So implementing your lessons can be a difficult process depending on what you're teaching, depending on the level of students, and depending on yourself, because it's not the most easiest thing to do, but with time and with practice, it can be. Use the resources out there. If you have a textbook that kind of gives you some guidelines as to how to lesson plan, read it. Practice. I would encourage you that you talk to your colleagues. If you have teachers you're working with who has been there longer than you, talk to them. I've done it. How did you teach present perfect tense? How did you teach this vocabulary lesson? How did you go about that? Because sometimes your colleagues can be very helpful when it comes to something that you're not terribly familiar with. Feedback. Always ask students for their feedback. Don't be afraid of that. Some teachers, and I was one of them, used to be very afraid to ask students for feedback because we were so afraid that students would say something negative. But sometimes the negative is a great thing because it helps us to become better teachers. So if you did a lesson with your students, what I used to do is at the end of the class, I would say, how did you feel about this lesson today? And just make it informal. It doesn't have to be formal. If you feel more comfortable with formality, you can even type up your questions on a piece of paper, and that could be a homework assignment. Students, I would like you to answer these questions for homework tonight. Then the next day they give it to you, you read it, and then you can get your feedback that way. But however you do it, feedback is critical. It allows you as the instructor to know how your students are feeling, one, and how they are moving or how they're doing in the class. You always want to be mindful of that because it would make no sense to go through the whole semester, go through all of this great material, and you think you're doing a wonderful job, and at the end of the semester you find out that the students really didn't like your teaching style, or maybe they didn't really learn as much as they would have liked to, or they felt that you didn't take enough initiative to find out how they're doing. You get into this business as a teacher. It's not about you no more. It's about your students. And some people will disagree with that, but it's really true. You speak the language. You already know, and that's great. But you are signing up to a job where you're helping people learn the language that you speak. So you don't want to make this about yourself. You always want to make it about your students. You are their voice, you are their instructor, you're their guide. And you want to make sure that you give them the responsibility to be able to take responsibility of what they're learning and give them the encouragement needed for them to come to you with questions or any concerns that they have. All of this really will make not only implementing your lessons more effectively, but it will make your whole teaching experience more comfortable for both you and your students. I hope these tips helped you today in lesson planning and implementing your lesson. Again, check out my blog, motivationesl.blogspot.com. There I will give you more details about how to actually write a lesson plan and additional tips as well. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to leave your comments down below. I greatly appreciate it. Please like, share, or subscribe to my channel because I will be doing more videos regarding ESL and also regarding motivation, because motivation for ESL teachers and students is very important and it's something I'm very passionate about. So thank you so much for watching. Until the next time.